Artificial Intelligence, a Fan's Novel. Book 1, Chapter 5, Martin. There was no explanation, at least none that Dr. Fraser could offer. He was as baffled by the boy's sudden recovery as his supposed experts who filled the medical journals with lengthy hypotheses on the origin and nature of Sinclair syndrome. "It just goes away sometimes," was apparently the summary of their confusing and often meandering ideas. Henry and Monica didn't really care. They had their son back, their real son. Explanations were a novelty at this point. They had raced to the hospital and listened anxiously as Fraser explained the process by which he found out about Martin's recovery, the sudden rejuvenation of activity in the cells of the boy's vital organs. When they had chanced to defreeze, it had been confirmed. Their boy's body was functioning correctly. It would take some time for Martin to be up and acting like a normal boy again. Fraser had explained this, but that was due more to the cryogenic freezing than anything else. It would be a few days or so before they'd hear his voice, and a few more than that before he was fully cognizant. Whether he'd be back to his normal self and getting into mischief like when he had been taken away from them, Fraser would not say. "There are so many factors in his complete recovery as to make it impossible to predict," the doctor had told them. "But he is alive and well, and he will start growing quickly the minute he gets out of defreeze and into a normal environment." He smiled at Monica then and winked. "You better dig up a variety of recipes or that boy's going to get bored real quick," he said. Monica had clung to Henry in tears as the medics wheeled their unconscious boy out of the hospital unit he'd slept in for 5 years. Henry clung back, and his face was flush as he resisted the emotions welling up inside. He became serious as they followed the ambulance home. "So, what about the robot?" he said. "David?" Monica asked. "Well, how many robots do we have?" Henry said. "What about David?" Monica wanted to know. "Well, I was thinking, now that Martin is—" He trailed off, assuming that the rest was obvious. "Yes," Monica said. Henry sighed. He had thought this would be easy. "Well, now that Martin is okay, maybe we could return him, to Cybertronics." He knew he had made a mistake when her face turned serious for the first time that day. "Henry, you brought David to me when I needed him. He's part of the family now. We can't just up and throw him away because we don't need—" She stopped herself. "Just because Martin is home," she said, correcting herself. "Well, what are you going to tell him?" Henry said, his face reddening. Monica considered this for a moment. "Well, I'll just tell him that Martin is our real son, and—" "No!" Henry said loudly, and then softened his tone. "No, I mean, what are you going to tell Martin about the mecha? What, that you got a robot to replace him? That you thought he was going to—" He didn't finish that comment. By the look on Monica's face, he knew he didn't have to. She'd been so overjoyed at having her son back that she hadn't even thought about the ramifications of David's presence when he awoke. Monica was lost for words. She gazed out of the window at the passing forest, the tangled vines that seemed to hold back the trees from pressing their way into the road. Henry was right. What would her little boy think if she knew David's real purpose? What had been his real purpose? She wasn't replacing her son. She knew that. But maybe Martin wouldn't understand. She held her chin up. She knew what would happen if they returned to David. She would never allow that. "I'll just tell him that David is a play friend for him now. I mean, Henry, all of Martin's friends are 5 years older than he is. David will be a perfect playmate." Henry saw right through the rationalizing. She was protecting David. He wanted to tell her, "He's just a robot, Monica. He's a machine. Can't you see that?" But he held his tongue. Today was a magical day, and he was not about to ruin it over the mecha. Cybertronics would probably charge him for the damn thing if they had to destroy it now anyway. Perhaps it was best that they keep it. "David can be a friend to Martin now," she repeated, as they came to the clearing of the forest near their house. "He won't be able to go outside for some time," she said, in a practical tone. But her face betrayed something else. Henry nodded and let her see him smile. That solved that. David and Monica stood over the sleeping boy. The men had finally left after making sure that Monica and Henry knew all they needed to know about Martin's safekeeping. Henry was downstairs talking with someone on the phone. His excited voice was happier than David had ever heard. The light outside had dimmed with the receding sun, and Monica kept the room lights low so Martin would not be disturbed. She tucked him in and fussed over his sheets and the machines that surrounded him. David watched all this with cautious attention. There was a new thing happening in his head. It was an uncomfortable thing. He had no words for this, but if he had, that word would have been jealousy. Cybertronics would have loved to know about this budding development. They had tried so hard to avoid this factor in their calculations. But David had been designed to feel real emotions, and if there were ever an emotion that drove human relationships, jealousy was its name. Perhaps, if they had been aware of the advent of this conflict, they might have made adjustments. Perhaps. But David would never be able to communicate this feeling, just as he was unable to communicate the pain being without Mommy brought him. Whenever she left him, even for a small errand, or to be with Henry, his brain overworked itself trying to calculate ways to bring her back. Every time she was impatient with him or sent him to play with Teddy, there was a small panic beneath his smile. Now Martin was here. He had appeared suddenly and with no understanding of what relationship there would exist between them. What manner of obstacle to Mommy would he become? "Now, David," Mommy said, as she poured something into a glass by Martin's bed, "Martin's going to need both our help so he can get well, okay?" "Yes, Mommy," David said. His voice did not betray the sadness he'd been feeling since the day before, when she had received that fateful phone call. "I'm going to show you some things to do and some things to keep an eye on for me when I'm not here. This is important, David. Can Mommy depend on you?" she said. "Okay," David said happily, smiling for the first time since Martin had come home. As long as Mommy needed him, things would be okay. Monica put her finger to her lips and shushed her mecha boy. "Keep your voice down, honey," she said. She knew that she would be here every waking minute of the day until her son was up and on his own again. But she had also noticed the withdrawn expression on David's face and knew that he'd missed her. She felt that if she gave the mecha some important task, then he would feel like he had something to do to make her happy. She had been right. David hung on her every word as she explained how the machines worked and when and why he should get her if something was wrong, or if the meter was on the wrong number. She also knew he would not forget a thing she told him. Her heart felt for the poor creature. Somewhere inside she felt that maybe this was an awful thing to do, to create a thing with human feelings, but that could never be human. No matter. She would never abandon him to the waste heap. He had come to her in a time of need, and now that her real little boy was alive and soon to be running about, she would not just throw her little robot savior away. That would be the ultimate treachery. David learned everything that had to be monitored. Martin's bed had a canopy, and the wires that ran to Martin's mask had to be kept from tangling. David would be expected to check this. He was also expected to let Mommy know when it was time to give Martin his medicine, which came in a little packet that was placed on his skin. Mommy had explained that the medicine would go into Martin's skin, and then the packet could be thrown away. David would throw the packets away too, and make sure that Martin's sleeping area was kept clean until he awoke and could do it for himself. As Mommy spoke, David looked around the room, and something suddenly occurred to him. Monica noticed his distraction and the troubled expression on his face. Well, that was a new look. "What's wrong, David?" she said. The robot paused a moment before responding. "Where will I—" He stopped and thought a moment more. He realized that it was not exactly an appropriate question. "Where will I sleep?" he said. Monica realized that she hadn't brought the subject up with David. "Well, David, sweetheart," she started hesitantly, "since you don't really sleep, I thought you might do Mommy a favor and keep an eye on Martin at night when Mommy has to sleep. Is that okay?" David knew this was logical, since he did not sleep. But that difference between him and the rest of his family had been growing in his mind for some time. The bad feeling inside his brain was growing with it. "Can you still tuck me in?" he said. Monica chuckled. "Well, I can't tuck you in, but I can give you a big hug instead. Will that be all right?" She guessed it would by the way the robot's face lit up. But even in the dim light, she saw something new in David's eyes. It was just a fleeting glimpse, gone before she really had time to register it. Maybe she hadn't seen it at all. The days passed by slowly. Martin slept all the time, but the machine said he was getting better. His antibody count was normal, and his respiratory system was operating smoother all the time. Soon he'd be awake. In spite of their encroachment on Mommy that Martin represented, David did his part dutifully, and Teddy was there by his side. Martin was real, and his clothing had to be changed. He also had to be cleaned up behind and washed. Mommy had done the real messy cleanup herself, and sometimes Henry would help. David was primarily responsible for monitoring the machines and keeping track of the medication times. But Mommy came in often to check on her son, and when she did, David would let her know what all the instruments said and precisely how many minutes had passed since Martin's last medicine. Teddy had suggested to David that maybe Mommy didn't need all that information, and that perhaps they should go out and play so she could be alone with Martin. David had not responded well to this idea at first, but he was an obedient boy after all, and he left when Mommy suggested that Teddy might be right. Outside, Teddy had tried to explain, in his limited vocabulary and understanding, about how Martin was different than he and David. But David wasn't really listening. He was looking back up at the window, to the room where he knew she sat quietly next to Martin's side. Every once in a while he would see a movement beyond the window and wonder if it was she. Then he would wait for another. It wasn't long before that crucial day, that day when Martin first opened his eyes. David was at his side when it happened. The sky had been fitful all morning. It sprinkled a bit, and then the sun would pop out. David had been looking out on the cluster of trees that surrounded the pond and wondering when he and Mommy would go riding on the boat again, if ever. Then one of the machines had spoken. David turned to see that the thin boy had raised his head and was gazing around the room with heavy, sleepy eyes. David knew he was supposed to call Mommy immediately, but something made him hesitate. He waited, watching the other boy's uncomprehending eyes scan the room until they alighted on him. The boy's eyebrows quickly narrowed. He stared at David for a time, his face unreadable behind his plastic mask. It was the first thing he had seen in the long years of his isolation. Then his eyes closed again, and he made a soft noise that David could not understand. "David, go get Mommy," Teddy said in an urgent tone as he came into the room. The super toy had been sitting in the hallway, sewing a break in his old cloth, when he heard the monitor beeping. David looked at the little bear oddly for a moment. Was it annoyance that Teddy saw in David's face? The super toy scolded him again, and David reluctantly obeyed. "Mommy!" he yelled, descending the stairs. "Martin is not asleep anymore. I was standing next to the bed, and he looked at me," David said, wanting to describe the way the boy's eyes had opened and then closed again, feeling the need to express the idea that he had somehow been a crucial part of this waking process. But Monica was already rushing up the stairs. David followed, but slowly. He did not feel like walking too fast. He knew what Mommy would be doing up there. When David got back up to the room, she was sitting, as he'd expected, on the bedside, whispering quietly to Martin. The boy's eyes were open now, and his head was laying against Mommy's chest. David stood and watched them that way for some time, before Teddy noticed his expressionless gaze and came to his side. "We should go outside and play, David," Teddy suggested. But David didn't want to play. His mind was working hard, trying to find a solution to a problem he had yet to define. Watching Mommy and Martin together made him feel distant. She looked far away somehow. If Monica had looked at him at that instant, she might have recognized what she'd seen in his eyes so many nights ago. "David," Teddy said again. David was afraid, simply afraid. "David, Mommy and Martin need to be alone." And thus was his fear defined. Mommy didn't have to die for him to be alone. "Martin, no," Teddy barked, as the boy lifted him by his threadbare ear. "Play nice," the super toy commanded. But Martin ignored the protest and hauled the struggling bear across the room in preparation for a new game. He'd been up for 3 days now and was feeling much better. His legs were still locked in the whirring cyber braces that regulated his walking and provided the necessary support for his weakened joints. He was not yet allowed to run or exert much of his limited energy, and he wouldn't be allowed outside for a while yet. So ever since he'd been out of bed, his frustrations had been taken out, as they always had been, on his toys. Dr. Frazier had come to see him the day after he awoke, and the adults had had a long talk with him. They told him that he'd been asleep for 5 years. Initially, Martin had had no reaction to this information. What was he supposed to make of it? Then Mom had explained that his friends had grown, and some were already going to high school. Slowly, the impact of what they were saying sunk in, and Martin had been sullen the rest of that day. But he was soon back to his normal prankish state of mind. He'd make new friends. Frazier said he'd be growing faster than other kids now that he was revived. He'd be the biggest kid in class, right? Then he'd found out about that blonde kid, the one he thought he'd seen when he first awakened. It was a super toy. This ought to be fun. "Let's have a contest," Martin suggested, placing Teddy on the floor across the room. "We'll see who he comes to first," he said. David was seated cross-legged on the floor. Next to lying down, it was the easiest posture on his mechanical limbs. He didn't know that, though. He just assumed this position automatically. He'd been watching Martin cautiously. Mommy had said that they should play together and get to know one another, and since David was an obedient boy, he would do what she suggested. He'd done a convincing smile for Mommy and agreed, but his brain was not so happy about all this. Mommy had ushered him into Martin's room when Martin still couldn't walk too good, and David had been introduced. He hadn't recognized the look that Martin gave him when Mommy had explained that David came from Cybertronics. He hadn't recognized it, and he hadn't liked it. The dark-haired boy had an angular face that David had a hard time interpreting. His smile was not exactly happy. His games weren't exactly play. After Martin placed Teddy, he came back and sat down at the desk that Mommy had taken out of storage when he'd come home. It had drawing papers and crayons that wrote in many colors. David had been intrigued by the coloring tools and wondered why Mommy hadn't shown him this earlier. It bothered him a little. "Come here, Teddy," Martin said loudly, slapping his hands against his lap. "Come here, boy. Come on." He repeated this a few times and then looked at David, who was watching him curiously. "Well, you call him too," Martin said, annoyed that the robot hadn't figured out the obvious rules of this contest. David didn't understand. Was this a game? He pondered for a moment and then looked at Teddy. "Come here, Teddy. Come here, boy." David repeated the phrase in a monotone. "Come on, Teddy. Come over here," Martin said, gesturing wildly for the little bear to come to him. David remained on the floor, speaking calmly, still wondering what exactly was the desired result of this game. Teddy was perplexed by Martin's contest. His face displayed his confusion. The aging joints in his neck whirred as he looked from boy to boy. Martin always played such difficult games. Then Mommy entered the room in the midst of her daily routine and picked up some folded clothing from Martin's canopy. Teddy's old but experienced processor analyzed the situation with logic as basic as the chess-playing programs that were obsolete before his time. "Mommy," the little bear called, rising quickly and running to Monica as she began walking from the room. Monica turned as Teddy jumped for her, landing on an old beanbag chair, another renewed relic from the storage closet. She grabbed the little bear's mechanical paw and lifted it. "Are they torturing you, Teddy?" she said, casting a knowing glance at her two sons. She left the room then, carrying the super toy to safety. Martin sighed. He used to be a super toy, but now he's just old and stupid," the boy said dismissively. He thought for a moment, his gaze intent on David. You want him?" he said. David did not understand this offer. Teddy was his friend. How did one own a friend? He pondered the offer for moments, but felt that the time for responding was passing. "Yes, please," was the only appropriate response he could wrest from his head. It must have been the right thing to say, for Martin made a satisfied grunt and looked content. He stared at David a moment, his eyebrows pinched in some unreadable inquiry. "So I guess you're the new super toy," Martin said. "So what good stuff can you do?" David was perplexed by this question. Super toy? How was he a toy? And what was he supposed to do? Martin gave David an impatient look when the mecha didn't respond. "Well, can you do power stuff? Like walk on the ceiling or walls?" He raised his eyebrows expectantly. "What about anti-gravity? Can you float or fly?" David sat motionless, his brain trying to understand the questions, but they seemed to make no sense whatsoever. He was just a boy. How was he supposed to do these things? "Can you?" he replied. Martin snorted. "No, because I'm real." David was confused again at this response. Was he not real? "I can read," David offered. But he wasn't really excited about showing Martin any of the stuff he had done for Mommy, like being a phone or a clock, or reciting long stuff after only reading it once. Martin's presence made an empty feeling in David's brain. He wanted to go away from him as soon as he could. Martin shook his head at David's suggestion. What the hell kind of trick was reading? What fun was that gonna be? Had his parents bought a stupid robot for him? He sighed and stood. His cyber braces whirred as he walked to the canopy where he slept and picked up one of his toys. It was a replica of a police amphibicopter. He held it out to David. "Can you break this?" he said, his face stern and expectant. "I better not," David replied quickly. Some lesson older than he could remember told him that breaking things was wrong. Didn't Martin know that? "Believe me, these things look a lot better in pieces," Martin countered. "I can't," David said. Actually, he didn't know if he could, but he knew it was wrong. Martin's heart sank further. Not only was this toy stupid, but it was a wimp, too. He had thought he'd enjoy watching the mecha try to explain to Mom why he'd broken the amphibicopter, but not now. He put the copter on the floor and stood over the robot. "Stand up," Martin commanded, placing his hands on his hips to express his authority. Was David supposed to obey Martin? Mommy hadn't said either way, so he reluctantly rose. Martin inspected this frustrating new toy. "Those dummies made you bigger than me," he said, after noticing that David stood taller than he did. "Who did?" David said. Martin couldn't believe how stupid this thing was. Did it even know it was a robot? "Well, they did," he said. "The doll makers. They made you taller." He ran a finger across David's face, from the forehead, across its nose, and over its lips. It felt like a real kid. Weird. "Why don't you look like one?" Martin said. David was getting used to being perplexed by Martin's questions. "Like one?" he repeated. Martin continued his inspection, poking at the side of David's face, then flicking his finger against David's front teeth to see how they felt. David stood still for this inspection. Perhaps this is what Mommy meant by getting to know one another. "You're not cute like a doll," Martin said finally. "You just look like some ordinary kid." He'd grown tired of playing with the robot's face. Maybe it wasn't really stupid, he thought. Maybe it was one of those things that got more smart as it got older. "So, when's your birthday?" he said. David knew what a birthday was. He didn't know why he knew. "I never had a birthday," he replied. Martin's questions were beginning to make him feel strange. He was being forced into looking in places in his mind where he had been programmed not to go. "Okay, so when was your build day?" Martin said. "When were you first built?" Something was blocking David's mind. Why was this conversation so hard? "I can't remember," he said, after a frustrated attempt at recollection. Martin had observed how confused the robot had started looking as he'd inquired about its past. Why was that? "Okay then," Martin said. "What's the first thing you can remember?" David's eyes began to roam as he accessed places in his brain, just the same way any boy's eyes would. Inside of him there were vast levels of activity behind every thought and gesture, numerous restraints that had been put in place to keep him from overreaching his boyness. The question of his reality had never been in doubt. It was a programmed presumption that he'd never question, even when confronted with the simple and obvious facts about his difference from the rest of his family. Or rather, he wasn't supposed to question the presumption. All that was left of the memories of his construction were faint images, sounds, coded instructions whose origins were muted by dead-ended neural pathways. But there was one thing he could still see in the denied recesses of his recollections. "A bird," David said. Martin was intrigued. He would have expected memories of quiet men in white lab coats, of repeated instructions and probing. "What sort of bird?" Martin said. David's brain fought against his questions. Why should he have such a hard time remembering this? Other things came to him instantly. But as he persisted, the images from his past became clearer. "A bird with wings," he said, "and feathers sticking up from the bottom." He put his arms to his side and fanned his hands back to exemplify the image. And with that memory came a new feeling. He didn't know this sensation. If he'd had a heart, it would have felt like the warm longing for safer, more secure times. "Can you draw this bird?" Martin said. David had not needed to draw or write since he had come to live with Mommy. He didn't even know if he could draw. Martin led him to the desk, sat him down, gave him a crayon, and laid a sheet of paper in front of him. David hesitated a moment, and then placed the crayon on the face of the blank page. He quickly began to draw. It was automatic. His rendering of the image was precise. A month ago he would have thought nothing of this. He still didn't understand why it came so easy. He just drew. Martin was looking over the mecha's shoulder as the image rapidly developed. David drew what looked like a man at first, standing with his arms outstretched. Then the robot added feathers at the bottom of the image, so it resembled a bird that Martin had seen in a display at school. He had been told that they were extinct, except for a few that lived in the zoo, that the floods had killed most of them. "That looks like a peacock," Martin said. Something mischievous flickered in his mind. "Can you say peacock?" David's head shot up. This was so familiar. He recalled someone asking him to repeat words over and over again while they... "Peacock," he said flatly. The word came out of him as if on its own. "Can you say pea?" Martin inquired. "Pea," David responded quickly again, feeling locked in some mode of automatic repetition. Martin smiled. At last! Maybe there might be some fun in this after all. "Now say that 2 times fast," he commanded.